Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining today's DATAVERSITY webinar, Gaining Business and Executive Support for Data Management. It is the latest installment in the monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. I'm very excited for this topic. It's one of the most common questions that we get in webinars. And just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A section. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, Zoom chat defaults to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to network with everyone. To open the Q&A or the chat panel, you may find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link of the recording of this session, as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an acknowledged data management authority and associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of DAMA International, and associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 12 books are many firsts, starting before Google, before data was big, and before data science. Peter has founded several organizations that have helped more than 200 organizations leverage data-specific savings, which have been measured at more than 1.5 billion US dollars. His latest is Anything Awesome. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
And thank you as always, Shannon. Such a pleasure to be working with you. We have a sort of cloudy day on the East Coast here, so I hope everybody else is enjoying the day, afternoon, morning, evening, wherever it is, wherever you happen to be. Yeah, as Shannon said, this is a common question, and it is really one that is deserving of a lot of attention. Again, just to start things off, this is the image that you're seeing on the screen when I typed the actually cut and pasted the title of this webinar into, in this case, bard.google.com. That's the one I prefer to use because it's a lot easier to use it in a browser interface than it is on your phone. But either way, clearly, somebody hasn't quite figured out exactly how to do this process. And it truly is a longish kind of process in the sense that it is something, A, we have to pay attention to, but B, we shouldn't all have to learn over exclusively. And that's something that I hope you all will continue to share the way we are trying to share with these webinars on this, which is to say, use this material, help us enhance it. If you have ideas, come talk to us at the conferences that we have. Come and present at the conferences that we have, because we don't want this to be hard. In fact, we want this to be easy. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a couple of different ways of describing this, telling you some of the war stories that I've gone through in the process of doing this. So it's kind of a fun little career retrospective in some ways too, at least for this first part, which starts off with Star Wars, although perhaps not the Star Wars that you're thinking of. Star Wars that I worked on, remember I'm kind of old, was what we called the project that Edward Teller, who is seen here conversing with Ronald Reagan in this picture, and he invented the hydrogen bomb, and he felt quite guilty about it. And he actually thought long and hard and said to President Reagan, I think we can come up with something that will help to prevent this strategy. Remember that our strategy at this point in time was mutually assured destruction. We are, of course, all saying, what does this have to do with data? Well, data and data management. The first one is storytelling. Now, I happen to work for the Star Wars initiative on this. I did some of my doctoral work on the planning portions of it and how this was going to work. And I was in the basement of the Pentagon. It was actually the old bus stop of the Pentagon, which is where they stuck the Star Wars initiative down there. And I was working on an old Macintosh computer, and we were doing some things that had to do with animation. We were using a package called Macromine Directory. It doesn't exist anymore. It eventually became, I believe, part of the Adobe suite on here, but it was a wonderful prototyping system. Now, remember back in those days, the computers were color was actually a rarity at that point. Most of them were still black and white. And I had a general walk by the outside of the office. We were doing something that was actually having to do with managing a lot of the images that were going on in this process, which was obviously a complex data management piece of this. But the general walked by and said, excuse me, fellas. Yes, sir, what can we do? He said, would you show me that again? And we said, of course. And he said, could you make that where you could tell a story with it? And I said, well, yeah, in fact, that's what it's produced for. It is to produce stories. So this little bit of animation that you'll see, if you ever get to my office in Richmond, Virginia, the computer is still sitting on my desk. It's just barely kicking alive. But we put together literally overnight this diagram of how to tell the story of Star Wars. Now, Star Wars was the idea that the Russians were going to send up a bunch of missiles, and we were going to shoot down all their missiles before they got to us, which would actually give us a strategic advantage. Now, that is the little phase that you saw there. That is what the general had us put together literally overnight in order to come up with this particular piece. Here's how these images were used in a very short time later, which is to say that there was a series of ideas that were sold to the American public on how to do this. And again, you're seeing here, these are the exact same images that came directly from our graphics. First, we're going to shoot it with this, and then we're going to do that, and then these things are going to happen, and it all, of course, works perfectly in demo mode, as we all know. We all love to have demos around all these. So we detect the Russian ships that were coming up. We do some relaying of some signals around and come up with, yes, the space-based lasers that we were talking about. They're not real, by the way. They don't exist just yet. Actually, I've said that was wrong, by the way. The first stage of this process was to throw rocks at the missiles. Literally, that's what it was. They were throwing rocks at the missiles. The lasers, I think, were the second phase on the that's right, X-ray lasers. Now, all of this is interesting, and the story was nice to be able to play a part in all of that. And eventually you can see we had many, many different artistic renderings that were basically the same kind of thing. The only problem with all of this was, and continues to be, that even if we really understand where that missile is going to be launched, as I'm showing you in this case, and I launched that particular missile, we sometimes can hit it with a laser beam if we know where it's going to be. So we're not really at the point of being able to do this. On the other hand, if you look at imagine the data management system for the Patriot missile, which is the one piece of technology that has truly come out of this and been commercialized. It's shooting at a plane there. There's the plane. It's moving very rapidly. And again, trying to work on these portions of it, you can see the plane is literally trying to dodge this particular exercise. The point of the story here is, of course, this was enough to sell the public and Congress, of course, because they had to appropriate the money on this process. And we said, look, the key to this, of course, has to do with recognizing that the problem is all about data management. And so there are another series of these diagrams where we showed in good detail the kinds of conceptual things that we need to have from a data management plan. And the neat part about it was when everybody saw this stuff illustrated, they'd say, oh yeah, they've all got to be, all the players in this piece have to be singing from the same sheet of music. And literally that's what they did, is they understood that, they got it in their bones, and they built the system architected correctly in that sense from the ground up. So next time somebody talks to you about Star Wars, you may think of it as the wonderful movies that are out there, but this was another phase of it. We called it Star Wars, and there was an interesting finale to it, just to complete the story, even though we clearly are doing good things here with the Patriot missile, and it's being able to rapidly go after things. There's the plane, it's going to dodge really quick, right? Wow, look out, there's something shooting at me, and this incredible reaction times on all of this. There's no way that any of this can happen if we have bad quality data in all of this. And the people who are on the front lines generally get this. So find, in your case, a story where you can find somebody on the front lines who can tell you something that they're passionate about, and use that story as we do that. Now, that's our first story. It's also going to be our last story. That'll be called The Chocolate Story, but you'll have to wait a few minutes for getting to that. Second story then here talks about the idea that there's an awful lot out there that we're not speaking with a common vocabulary. Of course, you may remember the Tower of Babel story from all of this. If you don't, it just was generally not in the Lord's interest for us all to speak the same language all of the time, is the general short version of that, so he made it difficult. On the other hand, as people, we're kind of doing the same thing to ourselves inadvertently. So customer, for example, may have different parts. wherever it's being used. In fact, I carry with me in my backpack a red fuzzy ball because I do this so often. If somebody uses the word customer, I throw the red fuzzy ball at them because they'll remember that A, some obnoxious consultants came here and threw a red fuzzy ball at us, but B, they were making a point that the word customer is too vague to really mean anything in most contexts here. So accounting, for example, well, that's the organization that buys goods or services, but for a service department, it's going to be the client. And for the sales department, it's going to be a prospect. Of course, you treat the data around each of these differently. Once again, find the same thing in your organization and start telling the story. Don't be obnoxious about it, but go through some details. Make sure that people understand this. I have another wonderful story that I love to tell, which is that I had two CDOs on stage at an event in Washington with several hundred people in attendance, and they both talked for a good 5 or 10 minutes with each other about this wonderful white powder that they had to do with. Actually, one of them was talking about white powder flour. The other was talking about the wildflowers. And they really talked for about 5 minutes about flour and hadn't realized that they hadn't communicated, which again was a precise illustration of this point. If we'd agreed on a vocabulary and things before, we would have been in great shape. This same level of complexity applies to all sorts of process labels as well here. And this is just a standard one that comes from the military context here. The Army, if they're given the command to secure the building, posts guards at all the entrances and says nobody who is unauthorized can get in or out. The Navy turns out all the lights, locks up and leave, because secure the building, of course, for the Navy involves a ship of one form or another. The Marines, if they're told to secure the building, send in a company to clear the building room by room, form a perimeter defensively around the building. And finally, the Air Force, joke, signs a 3-year lease with an option to buy on that. Again, wonderful examples that we've had from these things, but we have to be standard in what we're looking towards in order to have this, because understanding understanding interoperability, equals interoperability. I have no idea where each came from. So all organizations have structures. If they didn't, you couldn't have anything that would be working. Some combination thereof of business, process, systems, technical, and different documentations. It's the time of year right now, by the way, that students are graduating, and I'm urging all of my students, when they're having conversations with recruiters, to ask them which, if any, of these architectures are managed in the organizations that they have, because our numbers tend to show us that about 1 in 10 organizations does a good job managing one or more of these architectures. And the point of all of this is, if this architecture is crucial to your business, the architecture itself cannot be helpful unless it's understood, and understood is good. Documented is, of course, better in that sense. We need to document and articulate these digital blueprints in a way that show the commonalities, the interconnections among these components, because it explains things. Management likes pictures. The ideal understanding, though, and this is not what you want to tell management, well, you can tell them it's a goal on this, but it's why you really want to do this. You want to have the understanding shared by the business, but also shared by the technical components in IT or whomever is running it. If it's your outsourcer, that's a good one as well. And finally, by the systems. Only by all 3 of these sets of terms coming together are we going to be able to achieve the commonality in order to do these things. And the only way we can make that happen, of course, is by having again, single sheet of paper, if you will, on this, or some sort of a trusted catalog defining what our controlled or our common vocabulary is going to be. These have many, many names. They're all called different things. The real key is, of course, just like a watch, having 2 of them is kind of not optimal in order to do that. Of course, you have 2 of them covering 2 separate areas. That's not bad at all around this. But your business glossary has lots and lots of different components to it. Most people are not aware that when you put together a business glossary, it's the start of your enterprise taxonomy, and it defines the initial entities that you need to have in order to come up with a conceptual data model on this. It provides a wonderful source of integration and engagement with the business, coming up with agreed upon and meaningful entities. Again, the definition of a person is not a person, right? That's not the way you can let things do this. And any form of unfortunateness in here, whether you're missing your terms, getting synonyms mixed up, having things, it's all just sand in the machinery. And of course, you do not want sand to be a main component in how your operations run. It's too much, too fast, and does not help in the long run about this. Now let's talk about the way in which we can get people to start thinking about governance. And the first key to that is to understand that data can be an asset when it's done correctly. So again, assets are the things that produce value for us down the road when we manage them well. Marine Corps would be very interested in the number of tanks they have at the ready, for example. Data is the only asset that you have that falls into this interesting category of being non-depletable, non-degrading, durable at a strategic asset level. So our financial assets can be used up, our real estate assets can be used up, the inventory can degrade over time, but as a strategic asset, data assets really compare quite favorably to these other types of assets. And that means we can use them in a way that allows us to do more. Now, most people will see things and say, oh my goodness, I love this phrase, the data is the new oil. I really don't like that phrase. And the reason for that is, and it's a good thing to engage people on too, oil is not designed for reuse. It can be reused. If you're careful, you can recycle it, but you certainly don't recycle your gasoline. And so the question becomes, in a system that is simply a production system, there's no optimal reuse that you can put into that equation. So I engage people with this to have this precise conversation. What if instead we think of it as soil? And there's two things that help us in the soil area from a storytelling perspective. First of all, one does not just go about the yard and fling seeds randomly and expect good results. One carefully prepares the place that we're going to put our data into in order to let it grow. And secondly, nobody plants anything on Monday and expects to eat it on Friday, unless they happen to live downwind from Chernobyl. So again, two little important points that you can make with your management and say to them, don't think about it this way, think about it this way. But you're still going to need some sizzle, no matter what you do. There's no other alternative. We've got to get something in there that makes it look at such. Consequently, data as a really interesting and valuable asset deserves its own strategy and attention on par with organizational assets and professional administration to make up for past neglect. Now, let me give you an example of this. This is American Airlines and United Airlines out of an article from Forbes magazine that I'm giving you the URL to here. And in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, American Airlines was valued at $6 billion and United was valued at $9 billion. And yet the data in their frequent flyer programs, as you can see, was valued considerably more than $9 billion. Now, if you're the CEO of American or United Airlines, you would prefer the 19 or the $22 billion valuation, because typically it's tied to compensation, than the lower price. But I challenge these executives and think it's pretty much true that they haven't figured out how to do this, or they would have, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. On the other hand, if the data in the Advantage program was really valued at, let's just say 19 billion on the low end of it, would it make sense not to buy American Airlines, all $6 billion of it, and then hand that to somebody who really can run the airlines, perhaps even the current management, but then take out of that $13 billion of value that's there? It's a tricky problem. And that's, if it was easy, I think these guys would have done it already, is the point that I'm trying to make. So one of the things we do with assets, I'm going to steal a line here from Doug Laney. I say a line, it's actually a graphic that he's used in the days. When he goes in and talks to organizations, sometimes they are really careful about what assets they number. So if you need to know which stall you're talking about in the men's room, you can now distinguish stall 2 from stall 3, because of course of the primary key on there. Again, great topic that he's put this into. It's kind of interesting to walk into a group of executives and say, you spend more time and money managing your waste than you do your assets. That's a sure barn burner on that one. So one of the things that's important to look at, and again, I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Chris Bradley here, a series of 6 questions that say, do you have executive positions that support data as an asset? Does the organization track usage of it? Are there controls in place? Are the controls executed? Is there acceptance in general that we need to do this? I'm pretty sure that whatever organization had the numbered urinals, there was at least somewhere in management acceptance that we do need to have it. Find these things in your organization. Get your own picture that looks like this so that you can speak with management about something that matters to them. Now, let's take this concept a little bit further. Again, we've got to make these things simple. Here are a bunch of definitions for data governance. I'm not terribly fond of them, and I'll show you why in just a second. None of these are bad or incorrect. They are all different ways of describing what goes on in here. I'm going to give you another one that's perhaps more suitable to something that you probably have encountered yourself. You need to make an elevator pitch. So what happens here, of course, is you get on and the executive gets on with you and they turn around and they say, oh, what's that data governance stuff? I sat through a meeting and I really didn't understand much of it. Well, you've got about 20 seconds to come up with a pretty good explanation for it. And more importantly, it would behoove your organization to make sure that everybody has the same explanation of this. The one that I use for data governance that helps that elevator pitch is very simple. What is data governance? Data governance is managing data with guidance. And why would you want to do that? Well, let's flip the question around. Would you want the only non-depleting, non-degrading, durable strategic asset that you have managed without guidance? Of course you wouldn't. And that is, again, the type of discussion that you need to have with people at this very high level. So when they're saying, well, I'm not sure what this is all about. And one last piece on this as well, which is that, notice I've changed the definition quite subtly. The higher you go up in the management chain, the more data governance is about managing data decisions with guidance rather than managing data with guidance. Let me give you a very specific instance that probably has happened to many of you. Salesforce is very fine software, of course, we know, just like all ERPs are fine software and et cetera, et cetera. But I've kept a list going here, and it's over 20 organizations now that I know of that have installed Salesforce and then decided to clean the data in Salesforce. Now, the problem with that, and why that's a data decision, is because most people don't understand, particularly at the management level, that users can't distinguish between Salesforce, good software, filled with bad data, fortunate situation, or Salesforce sucks, right? Now, again, I'm not saying Salesforce sucks, but that's the impression that people get when the bad decisions about data are made by people who don't know that they're making data decisions. In fact, we can broaden that to a broader class of types of problems. This is a wonderful survey that our colleague Randy Dean has been running for years, where he's asking the same companies year after year, are you driving innovation? Are you competing? Are you managing? Are you forging a data culture? And you can see here the answers are largely no on this. He also asked the question, are your problems primarily technology oriented or people and process oriented? And in 2018, you can see it was an 80-20 split, and it hasn't deviated a whole lot from that. In other words, 80% minimum of data challenges are people and process based. And data governance is the only resource that your organization has to address these problems. So once again, find a type of problem that you have from a data governance perspective and make sure that everybody understands who else was going to fix this problem, right? There's not another part of the organization. Your quality control people might come close to it at some point, so I'm certainly not knocking any quality control. I'm just simply saying that most of the time quality control is usually pretty swamped with what they're doing. So looking to objectively treat your governed assets better is something that you can write stories about that will help in many, many ways. Another question that we're always asked to deal with just as a routine kind of thing is the idea of implementing data governance in an organization that doesn't have that ability to do that. It hasn't been able to do it. So I call this under ownership challenges here, and I want to make this whole area very clear. We were doing some preliminary work for the U.S. Army, and it turned out we were able to use culture in a very supportive way for this project. The key was that in the Army, literally everything that you do is governed. And when they found out that data wasn't governed, they went, oh my gosh, we have to fix that right away, right? So it worked within that particular culture to implement this. And this is guided by something called doctrine. Again, your commercial clients, if you're just in a private company, you probably don't have doctrine as such, but you do have things that drive you. And that's the kind of thing we're looking for in here. How can we find ways of making culture support what we're trying to do, as opposed to get in the way of this? Now, we were doing data governance for the Army. About the same time, the president required the Army to get started on something he called the Suicide Mitigation Project. And this was the idea of discovering that more of our war fighters were being hurt by their own hands instead of by bad guys was an intolerable situation. And so the president put some very significant efforts into it. You can see it's a dated story. It was back in 2010 that we were doing work on risk factors and trying to figure out what things were. We were learning how all these systems fed together and kept in one form or another in order to learn what they were. And we started to do some detailed data mapping. And eventually in the process came up with a 30 by 30 matrix and a room full of kernels. So I'll come back to the room full of kernels in just a minute here. But what the kernels would do is that they would get up as we were going through and figuring out permissions and stuff like that. Kernel X would get up and say, I'm row 11, and under column 9, you can put an R, and under column 13, you can put a U, and working through this. Now, we had a chit that we could get with the Secretary of the Army in this case. And so we brought the Secretary in for one of these meetings, and as they were looking through this room of data stewards, the Secretary of the Army put down his portfolio on the table quite vociferously, forcefully, if you will, and said, "Oh, I see what's going on here, Peter. This is kind of easy. From now on," addressing the room full of kernels, he says, "From now on, we're going to treat all of this data as my data. And anybody that wants to tell me why they can't use my data to save my soldiers' lives, my office door is open. Do you get the alliteration, everybody? Of course you do, right?" So the conversation immediately turned from, we got to be careful, to, yeah, we've got management support and we can do this. The reason I'm telling you this story is because he gave me permission to write this into one of my books, which of course I did with full attribution. But more importantly, I've had this conversation with more than 100 corporate leaders, and not a single one of them has been willing to make the time and effort to say that all the data belongs to company X. And it would stop the main thing that's problematic in data governance, which is that people are not data literate, and they consequently think they can own the data. So I urge you to, again, tell these stories. Just say no when somebody says, I want to own that data. If somebody insists on owning something, instead of allowing them to own the data, say, oh, great, I'm so happy you want to take responsibility for that. Here is what you can own. You can own the requirements for the portion of the data and the time that that data is under your control, which will force them to have a process map put in place that they can now say, we own the data requirements from this point to this point in the process, and then somebody else owns the rest of it, which is great documentation for your data governance initiatives around this. So again, just say no, and if that explanation didn't help, ask the question, what data would accounting own? After all, accounting comes in from, pulls its data in from all parts of the organization. And to say that accounting owns this particular aspect of data, again, would absolutely be appropriate from a requirements perspective, but from an ownership perspective, it would not. So I've said what not to do. What you should do instead is reference the term fiduciary. If you own the requirements for that portion of a process, then you have a fiduciary responsibility to maintain that data so that it's ready for harvesting whenever that happens to be in there for that duration. On behalf of the organization, you are entrusted with that kind of a process here. So again, let's not get stuck on owning the data pieces, and instead look specifically at what we can do in order to help everybody realize that it's an organizational asset. Now, Our executives aren't as smart as all that. We used to say in the military that if you were a colonel or above, you probably didn't have much computing experience. That was 20 years ago. We've gotten rid of that, but we still have people that don't understand their need for social aspects and social capital that they need to have. So I tell this in order to introduce the topic of data ethics tales. And again, this is fairly straightforward. Your social reputation is going to be important. Everybody's is going to be important. There are two other Peter Aikens that are likely to get confused with me on the internet. One of them is a rock promoter in Ireland, and the other is a lawyer in Florida. Again, it's absolutely possible to get these things. So I'm going to show you a little bit here about ethics. And what I want you to think of is not the answer to this problem, which is a unsolvable problem. But instead, what would it be like if the organization had given us some guidance around this type of a problem? So here we go. This is something called the trolley problem.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. Some utilitarians argue that the 2 cases are not importantly different from each other. Both have similar consequences, and consequences are all that really matter. In each case, 1 person dies and 5 are saved, the best option in each harrowing situation. But lots of people say they would switch the points, but they wouldn't push the man off the bridge. Are they simply inconsistent, or are they onto something?
Now, there's a whole series of these videos if you want to get into learning about these concepts here, but let's take this as just an example and say, what if we were all working for Organization X, and Organization X said, under these circumstances, you must always push the big guy off the bridge? That'd be really nice, wouldn't it? It would give us guidance. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but if that's what they said, if you come here and do this, you remember the trolley problem, you'll have to push people off that bridge. That's really good. At an entrance interview, you may say, that's not the place I want to work for, right? But my point is here about the guidance. And from an ethical perspective, we know virtually nothing about ethics around data. In fact, what's really scary is that most of the people who are working with data know nothing about it. They've got to replace this should I think, they've got to replace the can I thinking with should I thinking. Does it really make sense if we go and try to pull this particular or that particular thing out of this particular data? Now, I'm being very vague here, but it's actually a really good place to start off with something like the Netflix series called Coded Bias. That actually has been bought by many universities, and they have it in their university curriculum because they wanted to make sure it got out there. So I get to show that to my students every semester to jumpstart our talk about data ethics. Similarly, Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, is wonderful reading. If you haven't, I urge you to read it if you're a data professional of any sort. Kathy appears in Coded Bias in there. The Social Dilemma, again, another interesting piece of all that. I want to make one more point here. Just imagine if the organization said, you're always going to push the big guy off the bridge. Whether it's right or not, that's just what they're working towards in there. This is the first level of guidance we have in organizations where we can force them to hold to these. As knowledge workers, we can force them to say, yes, I promise if encountering that situation in the future, I will push the big guy off the bridge. Again, kind of a downer for a nice afternoon here. The sun just came out here on the East Coast, but nevertheless, it is something most of us would simply appreciate the guidance around this. There are some places to get started. This is a wonderful piece by the Open Data Institute where they call the Data Ethics Canvas. They're constantly adding to this, but a whole series of checklist type of questions. I find that while they're interesting, they're not quite as useful as the two stories that I'm going to tell you next. So imagine if the organization was being, in fact, proactive about saying, what should we do and what shouldn't we do? So here we have an interesting situation where it's an article where hackers apologize to the Arab royal families for leaking their data. So what happened in this circumstance? Well, what happened for starters was that a jewelry store in London got hacked. They got ransomware. And they said, if you don't pay, we're going to put this stuff on the internet. And when they put the stuff out on the internet, they discovered that the Saudi royal family had in fact made some purchases there, and that they had exposed the Saudi royal family, and that very quickly they were communicating in public to the Saudi royal family saying, please don't kill us. We're so sorry. We didn't mean to do that. Of course, they did mean to do that. They just didn't know that the Saudi royal family data would be in that particular trove of data that was released around that. Again, can you imagine your organization sitting down saying, would you advise a criminal organization to adopt data governance as a practice? And my guess is that most of the time when the ransomware occurs, people don't sit around and look a lot through the data, but they certainly look for obvious things like ways of making additional data. Excuse me, money from the additional data. Boy, look at that, I conflated the two terms in there. Just as a discussion question, these are interesting things for people to think about. What advice would you give them? Oh yeah, always before you put your data back out on the web, make sure nobody who's going to come around and has more resources than you and is likely to kill you is going to come in place and actually do this. And maybe we wouldn't tell them everything around about that. So again, just a little story there, links to it right there. It's a really good thing to pick up when somebody says, hey, maybe we should. And you say, well, have you thought about it from this? Or we'd never do this. Remember, you guys all know the old joke. What's the difference between a terrorist and a data modeler? And the answer is you can negotiate with the terrorist, but you can't negotiate with the data modeler. I know that's probably gone way over most everybody's head there, but that was a big old joke that we had here. Anyway, topic number 2 around this idea of ethics is fascinating to find out that people are just now discovering that if I have a public blockchain, every one of my transactions is out there. Now, the problem was most people don't think that it can be traced. And yet we've got already case law in place ruling that there's no unconstitutional search here because you bought something that was on the public blockchain. And now that we know how to reverse engineer the public blockchain and find out how to trace these things down, it is a fascinating new world where we're going around and catching all sorts of bad guys doing all sorts of bad things who thought they couldn't do it. If you're interested at all in that topic, the book is up there on the left-hand side, Tracers in the Dark by Andy Greenberg. He's done some really interesting writing in this space, and this is his latest that's out there. So ways of introducing ethics into it, and more importantly, of introducing why you need to be talking about ethics in your organization. We also need, of course, to increase employee data literacy, and I'd like to focus on knowledge workers, but I know that what we really need to do is focus on executive management first. Even if they have come in from a data perspective, which isn't typically the case in management, they come in just the same way as the blind people and the elephant approach it. Depending on where you approach it, you think that data is warehousing, dashboards, pipes, statistics, stories, depending on what you're looking at. Well, here's another perspective on it. And I'm going to show you just 20 seconds of Uber software trying to figure out something in front of it. Okay, so keep an eye not on the overall screen. You just look at the screen once and you'll see what's going on in the world there. But look at what's on the actual Uber screen that they eventually zoom in on in order to take a look. Now you can see right here, there's a horse and buggy in front of a car. Now, the Uber has already figured out that it's a truck, and then there's a car that's there. Now let's go ahead and start the video. It thinks it's a horse and buggy, but actually it says, no, it's a pedestrian. No, it's a truck. Now, I'm still not sure. We're getting closer to it. So maybe, okay, semi-truck sideways? No. Pickup truck. There we go. Semi-truck. Semi-truck heading right for us, right? Pedestrian following the pickup driver. I mean, clearly Tesla is quite confused on this. And the reason it's confused is because the architecture of most people's AI efforts are very problematic because they don't leave another category there that would be other. As soon as the AI recognized that it didn't recognize what was in front of it, it should have started to calculate the possibility that it was something it didn't recognize, and therefore the danger level needs to go up in this area. This is how illiterate most of our computer science community is with respect to data ethics and choices. If we had a category other, we could do something with it, but instead we're overcomplicating the area of data literacy by trying to look at all sorts of really crazy things, arguing primarily about how many courses that somebody needs to have in order to be called a data scientist. And I think that's not the way to look at it. Instead, I would take a very simplistic perspective and say that we need 5 levels: mobile, individuals, and adults. And those 2 levels we really can't control. They are something that societal pressure may put something on, but certainly nothing that we can put in place to say mandatorily before you hand a young person a supercomputer that is connected to the internet, they should be a little bit literate in how to use it. Just call me crazy, but I think it would be a good thing. We can, however, control these upper 3 levels on here. And the main reason is because when somebody is a knowledge worker, much less a teacher or a professional, data professional in this, they can be held to conduct by either belonging to an organization such as DAMA International, the Association of Computing Machinery, IEEE, et cetera, that has a code of conduct and requires its members to engage in societal interactions in a way that benefits society as opposed to not the other. Again, lots of good places you can go look these things up in order to do this. But most importantly, this needs to be done for all knowledge workers, because if we don't do it that way, what we'll have is the organization that will say, no, instead, what you need to do is come in here and push off the large fellow off the bridge in order to do this. And by the way, now, if you don't, I can fire you because you signed our code of conduct. The key here is that everything in this entire pyramid should be done in terms of remedial education around data science and cyber professionals around here. The key for this is that the ethical perspective below the line, below that level 3 where we don't have control over them, is to avoid being fooled or manipulated. And the behavioral focus is going to be on the individual. But if we look at the ones we want to do, we can say that our purpose is to avoid fooling or manipulating, and working for organizations perhaps that would have a primary focus of fooling or manipulating, and that we can force you to work on behalf of the organization for the 8 hours that you do in order to do this. Here's a couple of really terrible examples of all of this as well. Again, somebody presenting at an emergency room with COVID and asthma would have received from some neural nets a no big deal situation, because unfortunately the rule that it learned was that a well-trained emergency room physician who sees somebody presenting with COVID and asthma would have immediately sent those people to intensive care, and they would have gotten generally better treatment as a result of it. But it didn't learn that. It didn't learn the physician's involvement. We also have seen certain facial set recognitions can't see individuals. Sentencing algorithms are problematic if you use the old compass system that you probably have heard about. If you haven't, it's worth looking up. Terribly inaccurate predictions on all of this that were not good, but it was sold as snake oil to hundreds and hundreds of local judiciary systems in the process in there. And we can't stamp these things out individually. What we have to do is come back as a society and say we need to engage in a higher level of literacy all the way around. We are already behind, and we're falling behind even faster on this. Let me give you a very specific example. It was kind of fun. Again, occurred during the pandemic. Yeah, big politics headline in USA Today: IRS sets stimulus checks to more than 1 million dead people, the government watchdog agency says. This guy Michael Collins sitting there with his arms all crossed. If you actually understand a little bit about statistics things, Slate did a great article on it that said, you know what? Let's take a look at what actually happened. We had to send, I say we, the federal government had to send 160 million checks payments out. There were a bunch of dead taxpayers in that group. Okay, it's just going to happen. People are going to die. But in addition to that, if we did send that many out, that was an error rate of 0.4%. Heck, for a government-run organization, not bad. By the way, the IRS did not have legal authority to deny the payments to those who filed a 2019 tax return and then died. We can't keep that money from their estate. So in this case, it was proper and authoritative that we should have sent these types of things to people. Again, a great example here of saying, gosh, it sounds like the government did a really terrible thing. Well, let's think about what was actually going on. Government did pretty well. And remember, everything has to come down to speed, quality, and price on this. And speed was clearly the priority here. In this case, 2 weeks, they were able to deliver 80 million payments electronically. That was amazing. And the economists are looking back on this and saying, we've never had the ability to inject this much, needed stuff, in this case, cash, into it. So actually, we come back and say that's a pretty good effort on this. Once again, a very good teachable example here, though, that you can use to talk to people about it. Let's talk about our chemical PhDs. These guys are kind of fun. Work with them on a regular basis. $1 billion+ chemical company. They make all sorts of engine enhancements, fuels burn cleaner, engines smoother, machines last longer. Great stuff, right? Tens of thousands of tests annually, costing up to $250,000. We put together this map and they went, whoa, that's great, you're done. And we said, no, we needed the map to show you what's happening to your data around here. And they said, oh, okay, you have more to tell us than this. We never understood what it was. They turned our stuff into great stuff. Well, here's the first piece. You have people who are retyping digital data from computer A to computer B. Not a good thing. They're still using USBs way too much. There's too much ideas that we don't have the ability to understand how we're doing synonym reconciliation, tribal knowledge requirements, understanding which macros, how to cut and paste. And finally, not able to use, even though they had a database, the database hadn't been made Y2K compatible. So a fix in this, not just the fixing the Y2K problem, which was what we were hired to do, but instead looking at reducing expenses, improving competitive edge around products delivered faster to market, time savings and operational capabilities. The group says that they gain $25 million each year thanks to this data story. I quite frankly would have a hard time sustaining that number if it was mine. I do claim to have saved people more than $1.5 billion in 35 years, but at the same time, $25 million a year each year is a pretty steep ask in there. But nevertheless, it's their number, so we'll allow them to keep on with this. The key was, of course, that the chemical PhDs were spending way too much time doing things that weren't productive. After all, were they data people? No, they were chemical PhDs. So we should have no expectation that they would have anything that would be helpful within that context here. All right, COVID, of course, we undercounted it. Interesting, though, Microsoft got blamed for it. Kind of bummer, but what's going on? All right, well, not once, but many times people were having trouble with this because an IT error. Now, of course, we know coming from me, it's not going to be an IT error. Instead, we're actually trying to get people to still switch over to the .xlsx suffix, because that gives you the ability to use many more rows. Because if you use XLS, it stops counting at 65,000 rows and drops the data without additional notification, and causes us to undercount the beginning of the virus in order to do this. Well documented in the British press around all of these. I want to show you one very interesting way of communicating here that's not something that you'll probably easily be able to reproduce yourselves, although you may have a friend who can help on this. This one has to do with external, master data. And the key here, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is the idea that many organizations, in fact, the average organization has its customer data scattered about 13 different places in the organization. So Gartner calls this a discipline or a strategy, which is important because most of the time it's sold as a technology-based silver bullet solution, which is not helpful to most people in here. But the idea is that there's a lot of things that we need to hold constant. The names of people, places, and things. We call them parties because we abstract them a little bit higher than that to come up with a larger level of organizational ability to understand. The key for this is that trying to explain this type of a process means you first of all have to go through and say, we've incurred a lot of data debt in this organization. So to reduce the data debt, we're going to bring in something called MDM, which again, if you're not in the data field, it stands for, more people think MDM is mobile device management than they are that think it's master data management. But nevertheless, it is an issue. By the way, master, of course, is a problematic term. I've had people call me up and say, we can't call it master anymore. Our DEI people won't let us do this. Okay, but it was actually called a master file in there. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody has one of you will have a good suggestion later on. Of course, golden is something that people like, and that's great, but golden really only applied to the master copy of the records that you were making around all of that. Anyway, back to our story here. So this is a fairly risky process. These projects succeed in the same way that all IT projects succeed, which is to say that 30% of them achieve full functionality for the initial price that they were quoted within the time frame scheduled and deliver the functionality that they have. I think I said that right. Anyway, and there's risk components that go in there as well. Point being, not a very good success record. If my dentist had that kind of a success record with me, I would find another dentist. And yet, organizations think that just by buying some software, it will help them. Actually, the important thing is to make sure that everybody understands why you're doing this. And I can't tell you the number of organizations where I have walked the walls of the cube farms, and I'll hear somebody say, I couldn't figure out where to put the data, so I stuck it in the MDM. You never want to hear those words, because it means you've already lost the discipline around this particular exercise. So the story here is one on British Telecom. A good friend named Dave Evans told me I could use this, and the story accompanying it was kind of interesting. The chair of British Telecom really understood that there needed to be a culture shift in order to implement this particular approach to cleaning up some of the data messes in here. They commissioned for £500 a little bit of animation that I'm going to show you here in just a second that has some music to it. Think of this as a well-done version of that piece of Star Wars that I showed you originally. I'm clearly no artist, and that was a very crude set of representations. It did achieve the successful objective in here. And I want you to imagine if you're a person at British Telecom and you receive an email from the chair that points you to a link that plays this for you. Seconds. And I don't often make brash predictions like this, but I know the fact that they paid £500 for this. It was easily worth 5,000. It would be the easiest money I ever spent. And I would hire these marketing people again as quickly as possible, because they did a brilliant job of starting off with a great customer experience and showing the link that it needed to have between that and data. And it says previously information was stored in hundreds of databases across British Telecom. It was a bit messy, sort of an understatement, but true, right? It acknowledges the data debt that's out there in order to do that. So what we're doing is we're sorting our information into these 7 sisters. And after seeing this little clip, they could tell which employees had seen it, how many had watched it multiple times. Again, standard tracking on all this. When asked out of the blue, most BT employees were able to name at least one of the 7 sisters if they had seen the video. Of course, if you haven't seen it, it's hard to name them, but you see what I'm getting at here. What a brilliant piece of marketing to pull this all together. There's a link to it here so that you guys can get to it on your own if you want to replay it for other folks on this as well. And again, that's with everything in these slides here. Feel free to take, borrow, and steal and make your life easier around this. So Our last story here, as we get to the top of the hour, has to do with starting out by explaining to young people what a physical lock was. Again, remember, everything's electronic these days, so you don't have this concept of matching up the way these physical pieces do in here. But it turns out this is a great way to describe how organizations need to approach culture-related types of issues. And if there is an issue that is a culture-related issue, it is data. And you remember back to our statistic, 80% or more of organizational data problems are people or process-based. They are not technology-based. And that's where most organizations have made mistakes. So here's a wonderful framework by an author named Mary Lippitt, who makes it real easy to use. When I look at an organization and I see that they have vision and they have skills and they have incentive and they have an action plan, and I see frustration, I know what they're missing is the series of resources that they have to go in there. Similarly, if I see vision, incentive, resources, action plan, et cetera, I know that there's no way that we're going to get them out of their anxious state unless we skill them up. So the key for this is that Mary described very well. You have to have all of these things line up in order to make these changes, in order to do this. And if you show this slide to any of your executives, they will absolutely understand and then explain to them, of course, that culture is the biggest impediment to shifting organizational thinking about data. In order to unlock the value that's in there, it literally has to be unlocked. You can't just throw stuff at it. You can't just improve the quality of data and people will have it. And that was unfortunately one of the stories that happened in our last little group here. This is simply a group that tried to do too much at one time. As you might imagine, if you're selling chocolate, probably you want to have everything locked down for the holiday seasons that you have. Again, several of the retail groups that I've been with locked down their IT shop, no changes at all, starting in October. Why? Because they don't want any system changes to inhibit their ability to sell chocolate or whatever it is that they need to do at the busiest time of year. So that should make sense. And yet, this organization actually attempted to do several things at once. There was a billing system replacement, some sort of logistics component. The net upshot of it all was that they couldn't get 5 million pounds of chocolate to the places that were going to sell it for them. And what we did is we came back and we beat them head and shoulders and said, the reason you did this was a data problem. You didn't have the data that you needed to have in order to implement the changes. Everybody thought about it strictly as a technology problem. And the point was, it wasn't the first, year or so. I'm talking about this has happened over decades. I can go back and visit these folks and I'll start to tell them something. And even today, and I haven't been there in over 10 years, they'll say, wait a minute, Peter, are you going to tell us the chocolate story again? That's when you know you've made your successful mark and gotten people to really pay attention to this and really understand that data is at the heart of everything that we do, and that data is the thing that we can count. And so back to our wonderful guidance from Douglas Hubbard, how to measure anything. If we can't count it, it's not going to be there. By the way, he didn't invent that. That was, of course, a Deming quote, but he's got a great book called How to Measure Anything that I've used for a lot of inspiration around this. So we spent the last hour working through a couple of things. I started you out with a story about Star Wars to tell the importance of telling stories. If we hadn't been able to tell the story of Star Wars there, we would never have been able to sell that thing anywhere beyond the techie geekies that were working with it. That we need to have the common vocabulary in order to enable smooth operations. That we want to have objective treatment of our governed assets. If something's being governed, this is a good thing to hold up next to data and say, why doesn't data get the same rights and abilities in order to do this? It needs its own strategy. It needs all sorts of things. There are always challenges around ownership, but I challenge you to tell the story of Peter talking about his room of council of colonels and the Secretary of the Army saying, all this data belongs to me. And if they want to come to tell me why they can't use my data to save my soldiers' lives, my office door is open. I hope the emphasis came across on that. Of course, we're going to get into data ethics more and more in the future, and we need to start working this type of training and doctrine into organizations. We also need to recognize that employees, knowledge workers in particular, are the best source of getting literacy. That said, we have to do the executives first. If we don't get the executives, and most of the time I have to go over the executives and hit the board to come back and beat up on the executives. Again, we've got our chemical story. You heard that one. COVID undercounting, don't want to do that a lot. Really good example of communicating that. I would love to have a collection of these things so that everybody can get access to them. We're right at the top of the hour. Time to bring Shannon back on here, but hopefully we'll see a lot of you at the upcoming DGIQ conference. That'll be the week before we do the next one of these, which is Key Elements to a Successful Data Governance Program. Shannon, back over to you.
Peter, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for hanging out with us. Just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email for this webinar by end of day Thursday with links to the slides and links to the recording. If you have questions for Peter, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section of your screen. We are diving in here, Peter. Would you say the prevalence of executive resistance to buy-in toward a data program is a paradigm issue, given it is a culture change issue, or is it more a pragmatic resource acquisition issue, one more than the other or equally both?
I think there's going to be aspects of both, and it actually comes down to a personalized type of thing. You may need to use different approaches for different types of executives. I agree with you about the perverse incentives, though. When I tell organizations that it's going to take them years to clean up their data in some cases, they just don't want to hear that. Nevertheless, if you don't tell them the truth, and there's very little instantaneous stuff that we can do unless you want to have 90% of your business disappear all of a sudden, and literally you have no more data, you might be able to do something along those lines. Culture is an important part, and quite frankly, as a university professor, we've done a bad job of educating people about what they need to know about data. Remember, the only thing we've primarily taught people for the last 30 years about data, if they trust us, we take their money and they come to us for education, we tell them and we teach them how to build a new Oracle database. Well, that's because it's free, and that's one thing, but how often do people actually get to build new databases? Only usually under circumstances where you're in a startup kind of a mode, in which case you haven't got time to do this, right? So it's going to sort of depend on where the organization is in maturity and things like that, but it's also very hard to get executives who are incentivized to make the numbers go up by next quarter invest in something that's not going to pay off for perhaps a year. And that's a very big challenge, no matter which way you go with it. That's why I say, don't try to get your executives. If your executives get it, that's wonderful. And I'm very, very happy for you. But most of the time I find out they're not. But I do find that the boards of directors are, in fact, getting it. They're a smaller circle of people. They circulate information about data much more freely. You may have seen, for example, one of the reasons housing prices are so high in today's market is because the private equity groups have gone in and bought up all of those things. They did it for two reasons. One, they wanted to get the lift by squeezing the market, and they certainly seem to have done that and succeeded very, very well. But in addition to that, too, they also wanted to provide a common back structure, which again needs data standardization and all the other good things that we have. So even as horrible a story that is, that a group of private equity people are keeping housing out of affordable ranges for certain people, it's still got a data story back in there to it. Again, thanks for the question. It was a great one.
Very good question. So there's a question to see the summary slide again.
I think it was the outline, but yes. Guessing here now. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. We aim to please, right, Shannon?
We do, absolutely. There's a lot of comments going on in the chat, which I've really enjoyed too. A lot of discussion, especially around the ethics. I wonder too.
You're also stalling, waiting for questions to come in, guys. Come on.
I am. I know. Okay. I am. So. Yeah. So, and can people use your decks with the proper credit given, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. That is what they're for. These stories are for you guys to take them forward and do things. And most importantly, when you find something that works better, by all means, bring it back to us, right? We'd love to learn that. So I learned these through a number of good mentors and things, but yes, absolutely. Take these slides. Shannon will send them on out to you. And let me know if you need the source stuff, get in touch. I'm happy to. I work in Keynote. It's not PowerPoint. Sometimes this stuff doesn't translate well to PowerPoint. But fully qualified there. Yeah, that's really it, Shannon, is to just say there's so many people that are having to do this. It's hard to do. I don't want everybody to invent this process over and over and over again. These are things that we ought to have as common threads going on here. So please use them by all means.
I love it. Well, there are currently no other questions. I'm wondering if for this particular webinar, we don't usually, send out the transcripts of webinars just because we don't have the time to go clean them up. One of the words that the transcripts never gets right is dataversity. It always transcribes as diversity, which
nothing that there's wrong with that, right?
Right. We believe in diversity, but but I'm wondering if that would be helpful for y'all for these stories.
Absolutely. I can't wait to look, because it's always fun to see what y'all are going on about.
Well, I think that's it, Peter. I don't think we have any other questions. Everyone's just processing and deciding what to use for their own elevator pitches. I love the elevator pitch deck, by the way.
Great. Well, I hope we see a bunch of you at DGIQ in San Diego in just a couple of weeks, as Shannon and I will both be there. So.
Yes, indeed. I can't believe DGIQ is coming up already. And
hey, it's just been so much fun to get back in touch with people. It feels good to be amongst everybody again.
Yes, in sunny San Diego.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. And again, just a reminder, I'll send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides, recording, and some of the additional things that you all requested. So thanks, everyone. Hope you all have a great day.
You bet. Bye, Shannon.